Why on earth did Hezbollah on the 8th of October decide to go to war with Israel?
Hezbollah, I think, calculated that it could afford to have a kind of partial, to some degree, low grade, to some degree for show mobilization, and they didn't expect to pay the price they're now paying.
And now we're very honored to have on our show an incredible analyst. He is the director of research for the Middle East Forum. He is a seasoned journalist who's been walking around Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq through the worst of the wars in the region. I'm really happy to have with us here on the quad, Jonathan Spire. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Fleur.
Jonathan, you're one of those people that is my guru for everything North. Mm-hmm. I've been reading your column in the Jerusalem Post for years, and I really feel that your analysis is very deep, and you know things that most people don't know or don't talk about. And so I want to start with the most basic of all questions. Mm-hmm. Why on earth did Hezbollah on the 8th of October decide to go to war with Israel?
Okay, well, first of all, there's kind of an obvious answer to this, which is that, Lebanese Hezbollah and Hamas in Gaza are part of what's called the Mehwar al-Muqawma, or resistance axis is the usual translation to English. That's to say that both movements belong to that block of movements and states under the leadership of Islamic Republic of Iran and put together by Islamic Republic of Iran. So in this sense, we can say that October 8th was part of a more general partial mobilization by Iran of a number of regional assets in support of Hamas in Gaza. Hezbollah on October 8th was the first manifestation. Then, of course, from November, we saw the beginnings of the attacks by Ansar Allah, the Houthis, on shipping in the Gulf of Aden, Red Sea area. And we've also seen less reported, more than 150 attacks by the Iraqi Shia militias on both Israeli and American targets in Iraq and Syria. So there was a kind of partial mobilization of that entire axis, and Hezbollah on October 8th was the first manifestation. But of course, there is a deeper level to this, because it brings us to the question, okay, but do these movements simply take orders from Iran? Does Iran just sort of flick a switch and then they all roll into action?
And if already, why partial?
Well, exactly, right. And my sense is that it's not as simple as to say they're just taking orders. It is that they also have their own considerations. Both they and indeed Islamic Republic of Iran, I think, considered that Israel would not enter into a very long war against Hamas in Gaza. Their wrong but very deeply held analysis of Israeli society, as you know well, is that Israel is a kind of soft society hidden behind a sort of artificial iron wall, so to speak.
Like liberal, lazy.
That's it, exactly. And therefore it wouldn't have the stomach to sustain the casualties inherent in a long, extended entry into Gaza. I think many people on that side also thought, not entirely erroneously, that Israeli society would be immensely affected by the taking of hostages.
Which it is.
But what they, I think, wrongly concluded was, as a result of that sensitivity to the issue of the lives of hostages, Israel would be prevented from a major operation into Gaza. And therefore, Hezbollah, I think, calculated that it could afford to have a kind of partial, to some degree, low grade, to some degree for show mobilization on behalf of Hamas, so that when the thing was rapidly concluded in their favor, as they assumed it would be, or in Hamas's favor, they'd be able to say, well, you see, once again, we didn't let our brothers down. We were there when we were needed without paying a particularly high price. I think that was their calculation.
A little bit performative, a little bit low grade. Yeah. Let's just show the solidarity, the Islamist solidarity.
I think that's right. And they didn't expect to pay the price they're now paying.
And was this a miscalculation for them? What are they thinking right now?
Yeah, on the one hand, you can say it was perhaps a miscalculation. I do think they did not expect the extent of losses they are now suffering. And of course, it isn't over by any means yet. On the other hand, however, I do think that it would have been difficult for Iran and its various components and allies to have maintained the notion of the axis of resistance, which is very, very important to Iran's regional strategy, had there not been a mobilization of some kind. The whole thing, had Hamas simply been left to fight and suffer from Israel by itself, then people would have turned around afterwards and said, well, don't ever talk about the axis of resistance and this nonsense again, because Hamas got into trouble and you guys just left them to hung them out to dry. So to some degree, yes, there's been a very high cost to this. On the other hand, however, I think Hezbollah and indeed Iran behind them couldn't really have done much less, so to speak, than they did. And this, I think, is important to bear in mind because it feeds into analysis not only of the past, but also of the present and the future in the following sense. If anybody thinks that Lebanese Hezbollah and the Revolutionary Guards Corps behind it will take lightly the notion of coming to a separate agreement now, in spite of the things they've absorbed in recent days, and sort of leaving Hamas out to dry and saying, yeah, okay, we have a separate ceasefire, they should think very carefully about that, because they should understand to do so would hit at the very basic strategic assumptions that lie behind Iranian regional policy and Lebanese Hezbollah as an element of that.
So what does that mean? They're not going to do it? That America is pressurizing all sides to do it, but they will not come to a separate agreement with Israel?
My sense is that they'll be very, very reluctant. They don't want to climb up the ladder or down the ladder. That's to say, they don't want to escalate. I think we can see from the pattern of their attacks, they're very reluctant and concerned about the possibility of escalating to such a point that an Israeli ground incursion becomes unavoidable. They absolutely do not want that.
They don't want that.
They're in no position to absorb that right now. They're going to have, as you said, they've lost very, very important elements of their command structure. Also, a large number of fighters, from what we're hearing, were disabled by the attacks on the pages and communications. So a lot of the hardware too has been destroyed. They don't want the ground incursion, but they also, I think for the reason I just gave, are very, very reluctant to abandon that commitment they've had since October 8th, which is, yes, we'll cease firing only when a ceasefire happens in the south.
And where is Iran in all this? Because what we're seeing in the last few days is that their new leader is on a kind of charm offensive tour of the UN, trying to soften, I think, their own image, while at the same time, making sure that their proxies are still attacking and are still in business. Where's Iran in all this? Do you think Iran thinks that maybe Hamas went too far, they overplayed their hand? Well, where are they in all of this?
First of all, as far as I'm aware, no, in spite of what some people were saying in the days following October 7th, no evidence has emerged to suggest that the Iranians either ordered or were directly involved in the October 7th attacks. Everything which we know appears to indicate that that was a decision that Hamas reached unilaterally. So the Iranians did not, it would appear, order October 7th, which means they don't feel an absolute commitment or responsibility to it. Yes, they have mobilized partially, as we said, their various regional components in support of Hamas. They have not sort of put all the cards on the table. They've not said, okay, we're going all out now. This is the big war as a result of October 7th. On the contrary, what they're trying to do is do what they think is necessary to preserve the image of the Mehwar al-Muqawama, the resistance axis, but at the same time not endanger themselves. I think this is maybe worthwhile noting this. The Iranians are very keen on, to put it cynically, fighting to the last Arab, or at least to the last non-Persian. They're quite happy to fight to the last Afghan Shia or Pakistani Shia as well. But the whole notion of this resistance axis, to some degree, is to project power whilst not bringing Islamic Republic of Iran itself or its people into the direct line of fire. And that, I think, is important to Iran, and it is important to preserve those parameters. I don't think they enjoyed what happened earlier this year in terms of direct targeting and then them direct response. They tried, as I think we saw in April 15th, to tailor their response to such a degree that whilst it looked like a response, it didn't bring all-out conventional war against Islamic Republic of Iran. Those considerations have not disappeared. So Iran is there. Iran is backing its proxies. Iran is doing its very best to keep itself out of the direct line of fire. And my sense is that the recent remarks by Pezeshkian, the new Iranian president, reflect that broader perspective.
Isn't their end game? You talked earlier about the big war.
Yeah.
So in a way, they feel that it's gone a bit too far. They want to kind of rein in their proxies because they want to save this.
Yeah.
What are they saving this for?
I would put it in a slightly different way. I would say that the strategy, as we're describing it, has actually been doing very well.
For them?
Yeah, and has been producing dividends for the Iranians. I would say pretty much since two very major, not necessarily connected events in the Middle East. Firstly, the United States invasion of Iraq in 2003, and secondly, the events of the Arab Spring, and specifically in the context of interest to us in Iraq and in Syria. That's to say, these events in invasion of Iraq and then Arab Spring caused the weakening or collapse or fragmentation of a large number of regimes and governments in the Arabic-speaking world. And the Iranians, with their strategy of use of proxies, have emerged as the main beneficiaries of this. First of all, of course, in Lebanon, all the way back to the 80s, Lebanon was the first Arab state to collapse, and Iran capitalized on that. Then in Iraq, then in Syria, of course, also among the Palestinians, and we know also now in Yemen. It is the Iranians and their proxy strategy who have emerged as the main beneficiaries. Their methods have enabled them in all those countries to insert a kind of deep state of their own into those countries, which ends up, in all cases, which we mentioned, being either as strong or stronger than the official state itself. Now, it was all going pretty well. Part of the rationale of that, for it to continue going well, is you mustn't turn the temperature up too high, because then powers that are conventionally much more powerful than the Iranians see what's happening and feel the need to respond. You don't want that, because as we've seen graphically demonstrated in Lebanon in recent days, when it comes to the issue of conventional military capacities, whether it's in the field of intelligence or in the field of air power or in the field of conventional military capacity on the ground, Iran's enemies are much, much stronger than its proxies are, and much, much stronger than Iran itself is. So when it turns into a straight fight, then the Iranians are at a disadvantage. That's not what they want. They want to keep the temperature to a certain level so they can do what they're doing, for example, in Iraq at the present time, where they are simply slowly, day by day, absorbing the Iraqi state. And when the Americans leave, which they're apparently now about to pledge to do by the end of 2026, then Iraq stands a good chance of simply being absorbed into the Iranian...
Like another Syria.
Like another Lebanon. But the thing is that for that to continue happening, the victims, so to speak, mustn't know that it's happening. For that, you need to keep things quiet. Things like October 7th, October 8th, and what's been happening in the last few weeks in Lebanon don't fit in with that scenario or that stratagem.
It just seems to me... Well, I mean, I'm assuming their end game is that they want America out of the region.
Sure.
And Israel is, according to them, an outpost of liberal American whatever values.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this is why they don't want to say, of course, apart from the fact they all hate Jews. The point is, what needs to happen? I mean, do they want the renewal of this nuclear agreement? What is going on in New York right now with their charm offensive? Are they just trying to keep everybody at bay so they can continue to, as you say, quietly work their proxies to their evil aims? Are their aims Middle East? Are their aims beyond the Middle East? Do they work out of a religious fundamentalist fervor, or is that just a show?
No, I don't think it's just a show. I think the Islamic Republic of Iran is absolutely an ideological regime. It's worthwhile remembering that the people who are currently running Islamic Republic of Iran are not yet a second generation. It's still people who, as young men, or in the case of Ali Khamenei, Supreme Leader, not even a young person, were directly involved in the 1979 revolution. So this is not an ideology which has completely has become decadent or has become just in name only. I think they're very serious about it. I think they're very serious about power and the projection of power also. I think that the intention, as you mentioned, is first of all to replace what we used to call the United States-led security architecture in the Middle East. It may be a bit optimistic to still use that term, but that architecture they are in the process of replacing. I think more broadly, of course, there is an eschatological and a religious element to this, which has global implications. But I think in terms of practicality, yes, Iran is absolutely trying to replace the United States as the hegemonic power in the Middle East. And there are two elements to this. We talk a lot in Israel, of course, and for good reason, about the nuclear program. But I think it's always worth saying, especially to an Israeli audience, that the nuclear project at the end of the day is intended to be a kind of fail-safe insurance policy for this other strategy which we're talking about, of the use of proxies to hollow out countries and take them over and turn them into puppets/allies of Islamic Republic of Iran itself. And it's worth remembering how advanced this already is. If we think of the map of the region, between the Islamic Republic of Iran border with Iraq and the Mediterranean Sea are three notional countries, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon.
Yeah.
Iran is essentially the dominant force right now in all three of those countries.
Yeah.
And what they extend to is the Mediterranean Sea, of course, which Persian empires have been trying to reach since antiquity for basic and obvious geostrategic reasons. And they also extend, that landmass also extends to the borders with Israel, which means at the present time, should Iran wish to transport a military unit or a piece of equipment from Iran itself, from Tehran itself, let's say, to the border with Israel or to the Mediterranean Sea, there is no force in any of those countries that can effectively stand against them. So this project is already quite advanced, and the Iranians are certainly keen on continuing to advance it.
And where do you see the moderate Sunni countries, some of them who already made peace with Israel through the Abraham Accords, and of course Saudi that was on its way to making peace with Israel until this all happened, and good chance that they want to continue with that because they want a defense pact with the United States.
Yeah.
Do we have a chance here?
First of all, with regard to the states of the Gulf, we have to take, I think, each one individually because they're very different. If we take, for example, Emirate of Qatar as the kind of standout country, they're following a strategy of support for political Islam, in the hope to kind of ride the wave of political Islam, Sunni political Islam in their case, to greater power and influence in the region than would otherwise be appropriate to them given their size. And it's worked pretty well if we think about where Qatar kind of gets itself a seat at the top table, precisely by helping to start fires and then saying, we can help you put the fire out. So that's the strategy they're adopting. I would say specifically United Arab Emirates, and then sort of along with it Bahrain, is a country which has produced or pursuing a very different approach, namely in the case of the Emiratis to understand that political Islamism is the greatest threat both to the region and indeed to their future stability, and therefore to follow a very sophisticated and thoroughgoing strategy of seeking to oppose it. And with regard to Sunni political Islam, specifically the Muslim Brotherhood and its various components, the Emiratis have been the most consistent and determined opponents of that ideology in all its various forms. By the way, up to and including in the Emirati case, support for some pretty dubious or terrible forces of their own. For example, they're supporting the rapid support. They appear to be supporting the rapid reaction forces in Sudan against the Burhan government there, because the Burhan government they associate with is associated to some degree with political Islam. Wow. So it's pretty thoroughgoing. When it comes to Iran, however, which of course is the main and central concern of Israel, the Gulf states are much less consistent. At the end of the day, what they understand is they are conventionally very weak and they need to be behind somebody very strong to protect them from Iran. And if they think that nobody's really there, and the nobody in this case is the United States of America, then what we're seeing their trend is to seek to accommodate the Iranians. They seek rapprochement with the Iranians. Of course, the classic example, the classic example being, of course, the Chinese brokered rapprochement and revival of diplomatic, or restoration rather, of diplomatic relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia just last year. So the sense is that the Gulf Arab countries are very weak. If a determined resistance to the Iranians is being put up in the region, then yes, we can expect them to get behind it. But if they feel isolated, they, as we are now seeing in practice, will seek to accommodate the Iranian challenge. And certainly I think with United Arab Emirates and Israel, who see things very, very similarly in terms of strategic analysis in so many ways, there is a difference, though, of the order of importance of enemies. The enemies are pretty much the same. But whereas for Israel, Islamic Republic of Iran and its various proxies would be seen as the number one enemy, and then Sunni political Islam, the Muslim Brothers, number two or three. In the Emirati case, it's kind of the other way around. They would tend to see Sunni Islamism as the main challenge and the Iranians as, to some degree, a secondary challenge. You see an example, for example, of the way in which the Emiratis today are trying hard to revive the fortunes of the Assad regime in Syria. Because as far as they were concerned, the main challenge really there was the Syrian uprising, which was, of course, a Sunni Islamist uprising. Of course. From the Israeli calculation, things would be seen quite differently.
That's really very interesting, because in our case, I guess, we have Shia Islamism supporting Sunni Islamism, and they see it from a different perspective as two different enemies. And for us, really, it's one and the same, isn't it?
Well, it is one and the same. But to some degree, it's interesting to note that in this sense, the Palestinians are kind of an outlier. Yeah. It says if we look at the Iran-led regional alliance, first of all, it's important to nuance this. The Iranian regime has a long history of supporting Sunni political Islam. We shouldn't have any mistake about that. up to and including, by the way, supporting and harboring members of the Al-Qaeda organization, which is itself actually very, very anti-Shia.
Yes.
So it's not that they can't support or won't support Sunni groups, they will. But at the same time, if we look at the main components of the Iran-led regional alliance today, the only Sunni element actually of note is the Palestinians, is Hamas and Islamic Jihad. Everybody else is either Shia of one kind or another. The Houthis are a different kind of Shia to the Iranians, but one kind or another. Or, as in the case of Bashar assad, at least non-Sunni Muslims.
Non-Sunni,
non-Sunni. So the alliance, not because the Iranians even like it that way, but because most of the people who are willing to draw close to them actually tend to be non-Sunnis for obvious reasons, they have ended up building a largely Shia alliance. So yes, Israel finds itself in the almost unique situation of facing organizations that are both Iranian clients, I wouldn't say proxies, but Iranian clients and Sunni. But most of the time, if you look at the Iranian centers of power, whether it's Lebanon or Yemen or Syria or Iraq, they're aligned with non-Sunni forces, usually against local Sunni enemies.
That's really interesting. Jonathan, I read one thing that you wrote about Jordan's role in all of this and how they're kind of the country, even though they claim to be stopping it, is really acting as a conduit or at least a pathway for Iran to support forces in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, of Palestinians. I'm assuming Hamas in this case. Just elucidate us a little bit of what's going on over there through the Jordanian side. Yeah,
well, what's become apparent, and I wrote about it in some detail in Jerusalem Post quite recently. There have been some other pieces by other people too. What's going on is that a quite extensive smuggling path has been carved out. Weaponry arrives from Iran to Lebanon by air, or usually by air or on the ground, and then it makes its way from Lebanon through Syria into Jordan and into the West Bank. It's not only about Hamas, it's very interesting. What the Iranians appear to be trying to do, and it's kind of smart from their point of view, is just to make the West Bank or Judea and Samaria awash with weaponry. They're not trying to build a hierarchical paramilitary structure associated with Hamas or Islamic Jihad in those areas, because they understand that Israel, with the assistance of the PA security forces, will rapidly dismantle any such structure. But what they want to do is they want to make weaponry available, and then groups of young men can come together in a kind of an ad hoc basis, get access to the weaponry and carry out attacks. And we saw that to create chaos, and to create chaos and then to extend that chaos as far into Israel as they can, using young, disaffected West Bankers as the instrument for that. And we saw that prior to October 7th last year, if you remember.
The Lion's Den.
Lion's Den in Nablus and the Jenin Battalion in Jenin were examples of these kind of rapidly gathered, rapidly dismantled groups of young men. Now, where's the weaponry coming from? The weaponry is coming into the West Bank largely from Jordan. And what we're seeing is that, managed by the way, by Hezbollah, Lebanese Hezbollah, and by the IRGC from Lebanon through Syria, and then with the assistance of smuggling families on the borders, who are Sunni Arabs themselves and who are interested in making money, of course, rather than any ideological commitment. With their assistance, the weaponry comes through into Jordan and then into the West Bank. Interesting thing to note is that it's the same smuggling families and to some degree even the same smuggling routes which are being used to transfer drugs, Captagon most specifically. Of course, then the drugs enter Jordan, and instead of entering West Bank, they carry on south, and they go south towards the Gulf.
These are drugs that Hezbollah is trading in. It emanates from Hezbollah?
Hezbollah and the Assad regime.
The
Assad regime is many things, but also what it's become, what it may well be on the way to becoming, is the Levant's first example of a it's narco state. It's a major Captagon production and sale of Captagon pills is a major source of revenue for Assad regime, which of course is short of money and needs all the money that it can get. So we're noticing this. Now, with regard to the Jordanians, it's not, of course, that Jordan is in any way complicit with this. The Jordanians don't want this, but there is also a sense that maybe Jordan isn't quite cracking down sufficiently on this. There has been a case on one occasion last year, or actually the year before, last 2022, when the Jordanians carried out an air raid and killed one of the members of these smuggling families close to the border with Syria, but there hasn't been a sufficiently concerted attempt by Jordan to crack down. Now, I don't think that necessarily the stick is the issue. It's not necessarily that one wants to punish or criticize Jordan for this, but I think Jordan needs assistance, from its allies in the West, maybe from Israel also, in order to get a handle on this. Because at the end of the day, the main victim of this, or one of the main victims of this, is Jordanian sovereignty.
Absolutely.
If the Iranians are running and Hezbollah, are running smuggling rings all the way through Jordan, that means that Jordan is not entirely in control of its territory. And that's a situation which I think, in everybody's interests, needs to be addressed.
So in conclusion, Jonathan, the picture seems pretty depressing and bleak at the moment. Where do you see the points of light?
Well, I think the main point of light, if we think again of the events of recent days and the last couple of weeks, what we see is that when it comes to confrontation, when it comes to real challenge, our side, so to speak, Israel, but also its allies, are vastly outweigh the capacities of the enemy. Actually, when it comes to a straight fight, they are, our inferiors. This is firstly. The second issue, which I think is no less significant in the longer term, is that what we can see from the example of Lebanon and also the example of Iraq is that when the Iran-led regional axis actually gets hold of a country, the end result for that country will be decline and eventual collapse. They're not able to actually build anything.
Sustain it, yeah.
Think of what's been happening in Lebanon since 2019.
It's a disaster.
Absolute disaster. A disaster which is approaching, really catastrophic levels. The country has defaulted on its national debt. Its currency is now down through the floor. People aren't able to even withdraw dollars from their own bank account because the banking system is in collapse. The health system is in collapse. The rubbish is piling up in the streets. As I say, people look at them and they say, well, this is a direct result of the fact that everybody knows who thinks about it seriously. Hezbollah runs the show, and people don't want to invest in a country like that. The money that used to come from the Gulf, the money that used to come from the West in terms of tourism, in terms of investment, has all vanished. And what you're left with is kind of Hezbollah standing on top of a pile of rubble, and claiming victory. And that's a pretty good, I think, example of what this alliance actually has to offer the region. And in the longer term, that is not obviously an attractive, sustainable proposition. So on the one hand, the conventional inferiority, which means when it really comes to a fight, we can fight these guys off, as we're seeing, and we can also dish it out and punish them as well for their aggression. And secondly, they have more profoundly, perhaps in the end, they have absolutely nothing to propose to the peoples of the region and to the emergent generations in the region.
Well, we hope that brings us to a point where people will actually want a better future for themselves, rise up against these horrible repressive regimes that have ruined their country, and maybe round the corner, perhaps a new Middle East. Jonathan, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that.